Thank you, Bruce. I could follow up specifically on that and ask the same question maybe in a different way. One of the real tensions with the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the smaller it is, the easier it is to get like-minded agreement. The broader we open the membership, including Vietnam, Malaysia, and now obviously the most difficult country to add in is Japan at this point, the harder it is to get agreement, but at the same time, the other tension is the smaller, the less significant, the larger, the more significant. Would you address more broadly the question of accession to the negotiations, willingness to let people in that process and the importance of that?
Yeah, well, what we're responding to here is the nature of engagement in global value chains. So even Peru, for instance, as part of the TPP, and Vietnam see that they've got some interest in participating in this sort of negotiation. So there are quite disparate memberships for both the TPP and the RCEP, and that has a cost for the negotiations, for the speed at which you can move and the like. And to give you some example, a TPP negotiating round is a bit like a multilateral negotiating round as we had during the Uruguay round. You have 500 negotiators with 20 negotiating groups coming together for a week's negotiations and doing that every couple of months. So it's hard enough for Australia or Japan or the US to maintain that consistency of effort. Imagine for Peru how difficult that is. And the same's true in RCEP. So it'll take some time for all these negotiations. On China and TPP, look, we'd welcome when China feels it's ready to be part of the TPP. In fact, we take care to brief China after every round of negotiations about the sorts of issues that are being discussed. And I'm sure other members feel the same way as well. RCEP, we don't feel like we have to choose between the two. The thing about RCEP that we most respect, of course, is that the core of the agreement is the ASEANs. The negotiations they have made between themselves and how they want to take forward regional negotiations. And so that's a process that we'll always be enthusiastically engaged in. It has to be said, however, if you go back to what I said at the outset, that neither the TPP or RCEP satisfactorily completely answer the agenda, the business agenda that drives, that is driven by globalisation now, in the sense that neither offers a full stretch of global value chain and the capacity to set regulatory standards. And those are the two things that are most important, and I think at the end of the day that means that we have to think not only about how we move these negotiations forward, but then where do you go and how do you get something that's of fuller benefit to our businesses and our economies.
Perhaps it's the 4 ice cream cones I had during the coffee break that are starting to wear off. But if I could actually flip this conversation and be a little bit more provocative. From business perspective, you often hear broad support for trade liberalization negotiations, but at the same time you also hear a deep skepticism about the relative significance of them. So the question I'd ask you is, does TPP matter? Does trade liberalization matter? In the end, is it more about symbolism and messaging? In the end, are not those business imperatives that you just mentioned going to move forward anyway without them?
Well, I think it matters if you listen to business, if you listen to the World Business Council and the others. They do identify issues of significance and interest to them, but they seem to be the sorts of issues that are discussed in the TPP and in other agreements, the Trade Facilitation Agreement that's just come out of Doha, the Plurilateral Services Agreement, the Environmental Goods Agreement, maybe parts of ITA, those sorts of things. So they don't tend to talk about the sorts of issues that drove the Uruguay round in quite the same way. It's these sorts of issues that really matter: demand growth, supply constraints in areas like human capital, but in particular the friction costs of business. How you deal it when you've got a new specialisation of production tasks that come about because of global value chains, how you reduce those friction costs in business. And it does tend to involve these issues around investment, around competition policy, around IP, all those sorts of things that these agreements are dealing with. So there's a certain frustration and with business about negotiations in general, because there's been so many promises made and we've had a multilateral negotiation that, as I said, has been going a dozen years. They've heard constant promises. My recipe is just stop making promises and get on with the job.
Can I draw you out a little bit more on several things you referred to? You know, obviously the beyond the TPP agenda, you know, working directly on regulation, et cetera. Obviously, there's a lot that happens, you know, behind national borders. There's a trade promotion agenda that is not tied up with negotiating free trade agreements. And I presume a lot of that's hand in hand with business. What if you look at the zone and the broader kind of focus of this forum, what are the priorities for, you know, trade promotion that are non-trade liberalization negotiation, non-TPP dependent?
Okay. Yeah, in fact, we just did a survey of business. We surveyed 1,600 firms who have been exporting for a dozen or so years. And what they came back with us were three really key messages. One was that what mattered to them most was informational gaps about how markets were working, about how procurement and access decisions were made, and that sort of thing. And the second thing that came through was, for them, what mattered was information about regional and global value chains, how they actually access those mechanisms. What did that mean for the way they did their business? And thirdly, their interest wasn't just in accessing markets to export goods, but often they were in things like getting cheaper inputs, about investing in those markets so they could establish some position in a marketing or distribution base, or even offshore production, but not so much that. So it's those sorts of issues that flow from global value chains, regional value chains in the region, and that's where we as an organisation now put a lot of our effort in helping businesses try and see their way forward.
Ken Peng, we have, again, a great opportunity to have you here, someone who's both in the private sector, but also in the political sector. One of the real challenges that was, again, highlighted in previous panels is democracy. I think one of our panelists said the defining challenge of the next 50 years is going to be democracy. And there's probably no place in which that is more apparent than dealing with sensitive issues around trade. Japan is clearly going through it. The US does. Australia does as well. As someone in the political arena, would you help us better understand, in Singapore in particular, kind of the role of, you know, domestic politics in terms of, you know, promoting economic reforms and how that goes forward?
Well, first of all, if I could just pick up a point from Bruce earlier. I think for businesses, I think what matters to them would be speed, access, and transparency. So I think if whatever agreements are able to address it and open up this and clear this, I think business will be all for it in whichever markets they're at. Coming back to Singapore, Singapore is rather certainly not representative, but in Singapore's case, we are all for open trade, and we are all for freeing, as free and as open a market as possible. And therefore, you know, in many of the things we do, you know, we would be promoting along those lines. But as I talked about this earlier on in my first remarks, I talked about the need to manage in our respective countries, getting your local politics right, in a sense, being able to hold your country, get your people engaged and on board, the importance of open trade, free trade. Because if, on the one hand, while Singapore is certainly an open economy and we want trade flows to flow both ways, we are now in Singapore, if I can share a bit about the challenges that Singapore faces now. We have taken a deliberate position of saying that we need to slow down growth, which is quite peculiar. No economist in the world would say you should do that. When the winds come, you grow as fast as you can. But in Singapore's case, we have, of the last few years, faced some challenges in terms of the strains on the local infrastructure, strains in terms of local citizens feeling that common space is getting smaller. But I believe these challenges are also faced in to different degrees in every society we come from. And I'm sure the same in China, I'm sure the same in Australia. You've seen some of these challenges that any government is facing, and how to deal with it, striking this balance, recalibrating this balance between how much to open up and at the same time being able to bring your own citizens on board with your plans. So I go back to my earlier point that I think no one should lose sight of the need to manage your own local politics, your own local affairs, and holding the ground and making sure that their needs are looked after. Because only when their needs are looked after, you can then talk about other things. Otherwise, we can talk about free trade, but if unemployment is high, if there's some imbalance imbalance in terms of locals versus foreigners, in a very loose sense of the word, I think these will lead to more to governments and people looking inward rather than outward, and that could then spell out, in fact, put up a lot of barriers to FTAs. More barriers to a need to open up markets. So my fear is that going forward, with the challenges that each country is facing, there is a possibility that countries, for their own reasons, for their own domestic reasons, may need to slow down the pace of opening up. And that's something which I think will make, whether it's the TPP, the RCEP, the conclusion a lot further than what we all hope for.
A sobering comment from Kian Piang. I would actually want to draw everybody's attention again to page 11 in the brochure that we handed out over lunch. This is one of the slides that we didn't have a chance to look at the lunchtime, but it does a remarkable job of kind of ranking the countries within the zone in terms of business climate, in terms of ease of doing business, and in terms of overall economic freedom. And it's interesting, this part of the conversation we had with Kian Piang a second probably highlights the particular challenge of being number one on that list, right? China, of course, has a very different challenge. And so part of the discussion for the last decade about free trade, particularly after China came into WTO, is that China has a different model for organizing trade in the region. In the earlier panel, we talked about maybe competing demands for how standards and norms in the regions are organized. Some would say that the wide range of free trade agreements or economic partnership agreements that China has negotiated in the last decade aren't necessarily classical free trade. They're almost more trade exclusionary than others. Given China's domestic situation, I'm curious as to what you see as the driving rationale for China to participate in the RCEP, to continue to promote bilateral free trade agreements, or even one day to join the TPP. Is it driven primarily by domestic politics, by economics, by politics, by geopolitics? I'd like to have a better understanding from your perspective as to what drives China on trade.
Okay, very simple. By economic benefits. Just take China-ASEAN FTA arrangements as an example. During the past 10 years, China-ASEAN trade has been doubled, more than doubled. And so that both sides, I mean ASEAN and China, agreed to put for a bolder plan to upgrade the FTA arrangements. Say we will enjoy freer trade investments especially the mutual investments between the two sides. So by the same token, in other words, many people say China enjoyed a lot from the globalization. It's true. And at the beginning stage of the opening door policy, I would say majority of Chinese were suspicious or resistant to the opening door. But now I would say majority to the opposite, simply because more and more Chinese people has recognized the great benefits and the great potentials from the free trade and investments. So now you have seen Chinese government is getting more and more positive for any type of free trade and investment arrangements, either bilateral or multilateral, simply because the majority of Chinese people's willingness and simply because of the benefits we have got and the potentials we are expecting.
One of the themes I think we've heard all day long is that despite our talk about the zone as a whole and Asia as a whole, there's tremendous diversity within the region itself. And my presumption is that's also true when it comes to trade liberalization. And even here in this panel, my guess is there's different views in terms of who the primary drivers are in terms of trade liberalization, whether government strategy or whether it's businesses pushing it. So I'd like to put that question to you. Looking forward for the next 5 years, whether it's through the TPP or the RCEP or bilateral China-Australia, who are the primary drivers in your respective societies for further progress on free trade and liberalization? Why don't we start with you, Bruce?
Well, look, I quite agree that protectionism has become a resurgent issue. We thought we'd won this debate in this country, for instance, a decade or more ago, but globalisation means that it's more and more prominent. So the first thing I'd say about liberalisation is that everybody has to do a better job of talking with their communities about what economic growth actually entails in terms of openness, in terms of all the sorts of issues we've talked about. And that will be a significant thing if we all actually want to achieve further economic growth through liberalisation. Where's the drive going to come from? Well, I think business in large part, and that's one of the issues we're grappling with the G20 about it. And the B20 has got, as part of its agenda this year, certainly a lot of focus on infrastructure and investment related issues, but also on trade policy, trying to really translate what global economic growth means in terms of some of the things I talked about earlier, like friction costs, and then put it into the context of, well, what does that mean that our leaders should discuss, even agree on when it comes to the general direction and pace of global market liberalisation and openness. And so those two things, I think, are the key things that we need to keep in mind. Now, we also shouldn't forget, of course, that trade policy has been driven a long time by the notion that more open economies ultimately are to the benefit of all countries, including, of course, the least developed and developing economies, ensuring they have proper access, the proper opportunity to grow. So that voice of recent times seems to have been lost a little bit, but I think leaders need to, and all of us should remind ourselves that that means that many markets which are still closed to the poorest of the world need to be opened up. That includes the US and the EU and the Japan, the rich economies, and it includes some other economies that aren't quite as rich at the moment.
Ken Peng, you've given voice to the concerns of some of your constituents. I'm curious as to who you see as the primary driver for trade in Singapore.
I think for trade liberalization, it is the job of the government to do, and the government represents the people. I think we need to move away from, or rather move away from getting immersed into an argument that it certainly isn't a zero-sum game, right? Trade liberalization must lead to an outcome which is good for the people. To do that, government needs to find a better way to engage and explain this to them. But at the same time, because whether it's ASEAN or Asia, the fact is that it is the region is so diverse. and we are at different stages of development. And that's something which I think all parties need to recognize and not recognize the diversity, recognize the different stage of development, and therefore pace the demands, the desired terms and conditions accordingly, to also preserve regional stability within all regions. So I think that's something that we all need to grapple with and come to be aligned and be on the same page. Otherwise, I can foresee that all the talks will continue to be a rather protracted affair. And it's not in, whether it's a TPP or RCEP, it's not in ICU, it's not in the high dependency unit, but it's in the general ward. And it will take a while before we all can leave the ward.
Xiu?
Yep. Obviously, Chinese government is the primary driver for the free trade and investment, more positive and bolder attitude. But behind the scene, I have felt that the real driver is more and more powerful entrepreneurs in China. And gradually, I would say the government will be a sort of agent. And the boss will be behind them to dictate, to do this, to do that. Maybe like the United States, don't open such sectors or open more that sectors. And then China will emerge some, competing, interesting groups. I have felt but currently I would say the major driving force for the bolder free trade investment stem from our ambitious reconstructing plan of Chinese economy. The top leader of China is really want to restructure the current Chinese economy so that we can make the growth more sustainable. And through the free trade, especially through the imports, we can introduce pressures. We call it a 倒逼机制. We can introduce external pressures on our own entrepreneurs. So I have seen a very interesting interactions between the government and enterprises. And through the game, by the end, I firmly believe we will complete the reconstruction of our whole economy and make a new model for the sustainable growth.
If I can steal a trip from Stephen Walt in the first panel today, we've just got a few minutes left. After a sobering first panel over the horizon, Stephen asked all the participants whether they were optimistic or pessimistic. Looking at economic integration, and remember Brahma Cheleni in that first panel kind of gave it in a binary, right? One of the challenges of the region was economic integration versus political divergence. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the continued pace of economic integration in the zone? And if so, kind of in a short sentence, why? Why are you optimistic? Or if you're pessimistic, why? We'll start with you, Yang-Xi, then we're back.
I'm optimistic, but with a special term, say, free trade and investment framework with specific characteristics. If we say integration like a EU model, I'm pessimistic. But if we say free trade and investment framework or architecture multi-tailored and diversified, I'll be optimistic.
Thank you. Ken Peng?
I'm actually optimistic, notwithstanding what I said earlier. I'm optimistic because I think underpinning all this, we have the regional architecture has many overlapping structures which allow us to actually work at it. And I think at the end of the day, it is in everyone's interest, government and people and businesses, to see all this succeed, to see economies grow. So it is a question of time. It is a question of time, and it is a question of the intensity of some of these negotiations. So, but I am optimistic that end of the day, the market will sort itself out. Government, people, and businesses will sort itself out, and we will be able to reach a common position, which is to improve the lives of society.
Optimistic because most, if not all, economies understand that their growth involves interconnections with others, because they're all facing, or most of them are facing, burgeoning middle classes with new demands for their standards of living, and lastly, because we have very good habits of cooperation and consultation in this region, many of which are born through something that no one today has mentioned, and that is APEC, which has been a singular success story in day-to-day consultation and cooperation across a myriad of officials and businesses within the region.
Well, thank you. I think you will agree this has been a wonderful panel. We could go on for a long time, but we want to keep our time sacrosanct because we have the highlight of the day. The most famous duo since the two tenors, the two vice chancellors, are going to give us kind of their wisdom as they wrap up what has been a very fulfilling day. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent and insightful remarks.